It was on the last evening that Jesus Christ spent with his disciples. As they kept that last Passover, Jesus had still so much to say and explain to his disciples. If they had been prepared to receive what he had longed to impart to them, they would have been spared so much grief, so much sorrow, anguish, disappointment, and uncertainty about the future. If they would have just listened to some of the clues that Jesus had given for at least days ahead, if not weeks ahead, of his crucifixion. For 3.5 years, Jesus gave his disciples day-to-day training. He would make the plans. He'd organize where they were going to go, what town they were going to go to, where he was going to send his disciples ahead of him to proclaim his coming, where they were going to stay, all these things. He gave them the words to preach. He gave them the power to perform miracles. I won't turn to Mark 3, verse 14. It says, "And then he appointed 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have power to heal sicknesses and to cast out demons." Matthew 10, verse 2, it says they were given the power to heal all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease. What an incredible gift, a dispensation, what an incredible opportunity they had to go from town to town healing people. Here now is the quiet session. They're sitting in this upper room together for the last time when Jesus would be with them physically. He's trying to prepare them for his departure. His words are pointing to his own upcoming suffering, and it seemed to make very little impression on the disciples that night. Little by little, again, the weeks leading up to the crucifixion, Jesus had been speaking about his coming death. And he was trying to help the disciples grasp a reality of what was coming. 3 times are recorded in the synoptic gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, about Jesus pointing toward his death. In John's gospel, 4 more hints were given to the disciples before that event. Jesus saw that they could not bear that night all the things he wanted to tell them. There was a spiritual roadblock in the hearts and attitudes of his disciples that night of the Passover. Their focus should have been on their teacher and what he was trying to tell them and the distress that he was under. But instead, they had brought into that Passover a lingering attitude of jealousy, of contention, and animosity, and competition toward one another. Today I'd like to share a contrast between 2 individuals in the New Testament, the attitudes of their hearts during those last few days before the crucifixion. My title today, A Tale of Two Hearts. A Tale of Two Hearts. Please turn with me to Mark 9 and verse 30 in your Bibles. Mark 9 and verse 30. And as you're turning, once again, I mentioned that for the days leading up to the crucifixion, Jesus Christ is giving hints and small bits of information, not all at once, but helping to prepare their minds for what was coming. And now he's seeking a little more privacy while he's in Galilee. As we read this verse here, it says he's leading them in a place where he's avoiding the big crowds that normally were attracted to Jesus and his teachings. Verses 30 through 32, "Then they departed from there and passed through Galilee, and he didn't want anyone to know about it. For he taught his disciples and said to them, 'The Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And after he's killed, he will rise the 3rd day.' But they did not understand this saying, and they were afraid to ask him about it." It's really pretty frank and plain words. I don't think there was anything coded or a coded message in that. He's going to be killed. He's going to be raised up again 3 days later. They didn't understand it. Okay, so then Jesus addresses an argument they had had. This was the second time they had such an argument. Verses 33 through 37. Let's read. Then he came to Capernaum, that again is still up in Galilee, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What was it that you disputed among yourselves about on the road?" They kept silent. For on the road they had disputed among themselves who would be the greatest. Now Jesus Christ already knew this. He could read the intents of the heart of anybody he was encountering. He already knew this. He wanted to see if they would explain. Verse 35, he sat down. He called the 12. He said to them, "If anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and the servant of all." Then he took a little child and set him in the midst of them, right in the middle of a circle of the 12 disciples. And when he had taken this little child in his arms, he said to the group, "Whoever receives one of these little children in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me." His disciples had been clinging to an idea, a very popular idea, growing in Palestine, especially in Jerusalem, that Jesus was going to assert his power and take the position of King David's throne and to overcome the Roman occupiers by some kind of a groundswell of popular opinion, a riot, a coup, whatever it would take. People were starting to whisper and talk about this in the crowds that were swelling in Jerusalem. Remember, before the Passover and other holy days and festivals of the year, the three festivals, Jerusalem, by ancient accounts, might be 600,000 people, but by Passover and unleavened bread season, it could swell to 2 million people. Huge crowds packing in for the holy days and the ceremonies in Jerusalem. So there are lots of people there at this time, just before the Passover. And so they have this clinging thought. They place their own estimate on themselves, comparing with one another, and instead of regarding each other with higher esteem, they had each one of them placed himself first in that competition they were having. We're told in Luke 22, verse 26, a reference here, it says his disciples brought this same contention to the last Passover. They brought that same contention to the Passover. This time, Jesus was going to draw an even more poignant lesson, contrasting the authority that the world's leaders exercise over people versus how his own disciples should understand true leadership. This is a much more poignant lesson coming now. Please hold your place in Mark. We're going to come back here. Come with me to John 13 and verse 1. John 13 and verse 1. Here we see the opening scene of that last Passover that Jesus would spend with his inner circle of 12. Verse 1. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. He's talking about his inner circle of disciples and the broader, larger circle of disciples that also followed him, many others as well. You see, Jesus Christ had a full awareness of his divinity. He knew he had come from the Father. He knew he must go through this process of living out a human life and shedding his blood for humanity. Otherwise, all of humanity would have been lost. There would not have been another way to offer salvation. This was just a tenet that God had established from the start, that it would take Christ's sacrifice to redeem humanity. And so he leaves behind his royal crown, his priestly or kingly robes, and his majesty and his brilliant glory in heaven to come down to earth and live a life like you and I do. And he takes the form of a human servant. And one of his last acts on this earth is to wrap a towel around his waist and perform the servant's duty of washing others' feet. Let's read John 13, verses 2 through 5. And supper being ended, the devil having already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, he rose from the supper, he laid aside his outer garment, he took a towel, he wrapped it around himself. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet. What was so shocking about that demonstration was, historically, at a banquet or what we would call nowadays a dinner party, it was customary for a servant to wash the feet of guests. In a household where you might have a servant available to do such things for guests. And on this occasion, the preparations were there. There's a pitcher of water, there's a bowl, there's a towel. You kind of get the impression when you read this narrative that those items were available and sitting aside perhaps for somebody to take on that responsibility, to take on the servant's part. The pitcher, the basin, and the water, and the towel. No house servant was present. So it fell likely to one of the disciples to stand up and say, I'll do it. I'll do it. Nobody would do it. What did Jesus do? He waits till the end of the meal. Now, normally, customarily, this would have been right as the guests arrive, before they sit down to a meal. Not one of the disciples moved toward performing this very common yet lowly task. So here Jesus Christ is, the divine God family member who participated in the creation of all things in the universe, the great I Am, the very Son of God who manifested himself in the Old Testament to the patriarchs and the prophets. He rose from the table, laid aside his outer garment, once again, wrapped a towel around his waist, and one by one went around the group washing their feet. I'm guessing you probably could have heard a pin drop in that room. It was an example they would never forget. We notice that Jesus did not enter into any controversy. He didn't say, well, come on, guys, somebody step up. One of you needs to take this role. No, he doesn't do that, does he? He does it himself. And what a powerful but silent example and lesson to his disciples that they, again, would never forget. We skip to verse 8. We come to the place where Peter protests. He just feels uncomfortable having his feet washed by his Lord and Master and Teacher, Jesus Christ. Jesus says, if I don't wash you, you'll have no part with me. And so, because Peter doesn't know it yet, but he's actually refusing that higher cleansing that Jesus Christ is offering through this physical demonstration. He's told in very gentle terms, Peter, you have to surrender your pride and self-will. In the foot washing, the physical cleaning of the feet certainly represented the higher cleaning, which was something that Jesus Christ is looking for, a cleansing of their hearts that evening. Verse 9. Okay, Peter acquiesces. He says, okay, fine, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Verse 10, Jesus replies back, he who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. A person who was fully bathed was clean, but his sandaled feet on the dusty roads and footpaths of Palestine, they would soon become dirty. They would need to be washed again, typically. And so here, Jesus Christ really desires that these men, by having humble hearts, would wash away the animosity, the pride in their hearts, the jealousy in their hearts, because pride and self-seeking would also create dissension and division. And Jesus Christ could not continue the remainder of this sacred service with that in their hearts. So Peter and the rest of the disciples needed to learn that it's not a humiliating thing for God in Christ to serve us and work toward our purification. They had to learn that. Verses 10 and 11, again, let's read this because another point comes out. Let's read it again. Jesus said to Peter, "He who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean, and you are clean, but not all of you." For he knew who would betray him, therefore he said, "You are not all clean." We can see a couple of important points in that statement. One, as the attitudes of the disciples were being humbled through this servant attitude of their teacher, their Lord and Master, soon coming King, a necessary change of heart was being brought about, again, before Jesus Christ could go into the next level of that ceremony. Two, though, we can see here that Judas Iscariot was almost certainly still in that room, that Jesus Christ went around the circle and washed his feet as well. So we can conclude that Jesus had washed the feet of Judas, his known betrayer. Judas's heart, though, sadly had not softened. He had not submitted himself to Jesus Christ as apparently the others did. So he says, "Not all of you are clean," meaning there was one that would still betray him. Here's Jesus Christ, infinitely superior to mortal human beings, the very Son of God, stooping down to perform the humblest duty of washing men's feet. And so Jesus Christ wanted his disciples to know why he had done it, and this did not in the least detract from his dignity. And whether it should for all the disciples of all time, it should not detract from our dignity either. And so we do this practice every year. I may have mentioned this in times past, but when I was first being called into the church in 1974, I was studying some literature from two or three different Christian sources. One was Seventh-day Adventist, one was Worldwide Church of God. And I came to this almost single decision that this church, the Church of God that I became a member of, kept the foot washing ceremony. And I couldn't find that almost anywhere else. I had been looking and I'd said, wow, this is a very, very important part of what we teach and what we practice from year to year. So I thought it was profound at the time. I think it's profound even now. Let's continue. John 13, verse 12. So when he had washed their feet, taken his garment, sat down again, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. If then your Lord and teacher have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you." We know that after Judas Iscariot left the room that evening to carry out his evil betrayal, the 11 remaining disciples that appear to be still in that room at this time were in a different frame of mind, a different attitude that Jesus Christ could, again, take them through the next step into the memorial service which Jesus Christ was about to institute. Their hearts being softened, they became more teachable. They were able to focus more intently on what Jesus Christ had to say in those very precious minutes and moments before they concluded, sang a song, and then left in the moonlight to go up to Gethsemane, the Garden of Gethsemane. Here we are, just less than 2 weeks away. Baptized members will participate in this practice that Jesus Christ set in motion, reminding of this heart of a servant, reminding us of the heart of a servant and the need for the same kind of cleansing of our hearts. And this is still foremost on God's and Jesus Christ's mind. Remember David's plea in Psalm 51, "Create in me a new heart," he said. And this was while he was seeking forgiveness and a restoration into the relationship with God that he had lost after his sins. Now we hold our place in John. I'd like to turn back to Mark 14, if you have a marker still in there, a placeholder. Mark 14, to a second story. This story shares the beautiful example of humility that occurred just 6 days before that last Passover. It's often called the feast at Simon's house. Mark 14, verse 3, and being in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came having an alabaster flask, a very costly oil of spikenard. Then she broke the flask and poured it on his head. And what is spikenard? Just a little primer on that again. Spikenard is a very expensive spice used in making perfume, a very costly perfume. The extract is from Nardus spicatus. It can also be translated Indian spike. Today it comes from faraway India. It grows in the Himalayan mountains. The extracted oil makes a very fragrant perfume. It was used by the Romans in anointing heads of royalty. And the great cost is mentioned by a Roman historian anciently, Pliny the Elder. This comes from the 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica on spikenard, that in ancient times this was used to anoint royalty. So comparing Mark's gospel account with Matthew's and John's accounts, it's the same story, but John adds a little more to it. He adds that this woman who opened or broke the top of this little vial of spikenard, this fragrant ointment, was none other than Mary, the sister of Lazarus. That's in John 12, verse 3. This is Lazarus' one of his two sisters. Remember, Martha and Mary, two sisters. Now, Luke 7, verse 37, I won't turn, but there is another account with some remarkable similarities, but it's probably a different event. There's still a Simon involved. He's a Pharisee. And this woman being wiping Jesus Christ's hair with ointment is a sinful woman. She's living a life of sin. So this account of Mary doesn't fit, and Simon the leper doesn't necessarily fit, him being a Pharisee. Let's continue. Mark 14, verse 4 and 5. But there were some who were indignant among themselves and said, why was this fragrant oil wasted? For it might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they criticized her sharply. Now, denarii is plural for coinage in that day. 1 denarius, multiple denarii. So 1 denarius is a coin representing a typical full day's wages in the time of Jesus Christ. In our day, if you made a comparison, if a laborer earned $60 a day, then 300 times that, plural, would be about $18,000 in today's value. If you could make that comparison, 1 day's wage today, if it's $60, then $18,000, a comparable value of this little alabaster vial of spikenard. Very expensive, gives you an idea. Verses 6 through 8. But Jesus said, let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a good work for me. For you have the poor with you always, and whenever you wish, you may do them good. But me you will not always have. She has done what she could. She has come beforehand to anoint my body for burial. It's very remarkable. I read a couple of commentaries that show the contrast between the disciples who were afraid to ask and didn't understand and didn't comprehend his words to them over a period of days and maybe weeks about his upcoming crucifixion and suffering. Yet this Mary, sister of Lazarus, she knows he's being prepared for burial, that his life is coming to a close very soon, and she's preparing his body for that. Remember when Jesus just said, Mary has done what she could. Again, it suggests that she perceives that Jesus' life is soon to end. Verse 9, assuredly I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be told as a memorial to her. So here's an illustration of a humble act that Jesus Christ praises so highly. It says that this is going to be remembered wherever the gospel is preached. This is one of those opportunities to tell you about this story. Now, while this occasion is going on in the little town of Bethany, Bethany is just 2 miles outside the city of hustle and bustle Jerusalem, with all the political hotbed going on and all the swelling of perhaps 2 million people getting ready for the spring holy days. Very exciting time, except for the inner circle of Pharisees and the priests who were scheming and coming up with a plan to arrest Jesus Christ. There was that going on. So while this teachable moment was going on at Simon's house, again, there's a lot of excitement going on just 2 miles away. And Jesus Christ and his mission were gaining more and more attention than ever before. It was coming to a peak as he makes his triumphant walk on a donkey into Jerusalem before those last couple of days take place before his crucifixion. Public sentiment was growing. Again, people talking about maybe this man Jesus is going to declare himself king over Israel. They were excited about this. Now we turn to John 12, verse 9. Let's go back over to John 12, verse 9. It says some of those who had come to keep the spring feast were watching Jesus' movements. Some were sent out as spies by the priesthood, watching for his arrival. They were looking for opportunities to seize him and have him killed. It says in verse 9, now a great many of the Jews knew that he was there, and they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might also see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. But the chief priests plotted to put Lazarus to death also, because on account of him many of the Jews went away and believed in Jesus. Word spread really fast after Lazarus came out of the grave after 4 days and 4 nights. And Jesus Christ shouted, and he says, remove the stone. And here comes Lazarus walking out of the tomb. That word spread really fast through Jerusalem. So it's a pretty exciting time. Now, Jesus had brought Lazarus back from the dead. A lot of people were paying attention, listening to this healer, this teacher, this prophet. And the religious leadership said to themselves, as long as Lazarus is alive, they knew that this public incident was going to cause a whole lot of people moving away from the religious order of the day. And so there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of angst over this. In the Sanhedrin, which is the Council of 70, they decided that Lazarus must also die. In their minds, Lazarus was too powerful a testimony of the divine power of this one man, Jesus Christ. And they were desperately trying to discredit him as an impostor, a false prophet, a revolutionary, and one born out of wedlock. You see all these kinds of rumors and these falsehoods said about Jesus Christ. So a meeting of the council and the chief priests and Pharisees is called. They determine to take him secretly, Jesus Christ. They want to carry out a trial as quietly as possible to prevent a riot, an uprising among the people. And they set in motion one evil decision after another. Skipping to John 12, verse 17. Therefore, the people who were with him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead bore witness. For this reason, the people also met him, Jesus, because they had heard that he had done a great sign. The Pharisees therefore said among themselves, you see that you are accomplishing nothing. Look, the world has gone after him. And they feared for their own position under the oversight of the Roman occupiers. Skip back with me to John 11, verse 1. Let's go back a chapter. John 11, verse 1. This is just days earlier. Jesus and his disciples are still in Galilee. Remember, Galilee is to the north, Jerusalem and Judea is to the south. Jesus Christ did most of his preaching and most of his miracle working in Galilee, where the people were more receptive. There was much more controversy, there was much more tension, much more political shall we say, tensions, and spies were always sent out, and there were constantly these lawyers and priests who were trying to trip Jesus Christ up and foil his mission. So he's back up in Galilee at this time. Lazarus is sick at this time, but he's still alive. Verses 1 through 27, let's read quickly here. It says, "Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was that Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair." Now this is John writing this many years later. So it was that Mary who later anointed Jesus Christ with fragrant oil. So in the context, you say, well, okay, when did this happen? John is writing this whole account years later. He's referencing which Mary this is, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore the sisters said to him, "Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick." Verse 4, when Jesus heard that, he said, "This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister Mary and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was, up in Galilee. Remember, Lazarus and the family are down south in Judea, in Bethany. And they had sent a messenger up to tell him about Lazarus' illness. Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Okay, now let's go down to Judea again." Verse 8. The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, lately the Jews sought to stone you, and you're going to go down there again? Back to Judea?" Again, just 2 miles from this hotbed of political strife and tension and animosity toward Jesus Christ in Jerusalem. Verse 9, Jesus says, "Are there not 12 hours in a day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if one walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him." These things he said, and after that he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I might wake him up." Verse 12, the disciples say, "Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get well." However, Jesus Christ spoke of his death, but they thought he was speaking about him resting in natural sleep. Verse 14, Jesus says plainly, "Guys, listen, Lazarus is dead. I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let's go to him." It has to have them scratching their heads. Why in the world? You waited 2 days. Now he's dead. Word comes up here to Galilee. Why would we go see him now? Well, we'll find out. Verse 16, then Thomas, called the twin, says to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go that we may die with him." They think this is a walking into a death trap, that this is a last stand, Custer's last stand for them all. So he's kind of trying to brace himself for dying with Jesus Christ. Verse 17, when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 4 miles away. Many of the Jews had joined the women around Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. There were the mourners, and there were the people that walked from Jerusalem to comfort the family. John 11, verse 20. Now Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, she ran out along the path to meet him. But Mary stayed in the house. She was sitting in the house. Martha, meeting Jesus, said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you." Jesus said something, a matter of fact. He says, "Your brother's going to rise again." Verse 24, Martha says, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus Christ had been teaching this. It says in John 5, verse 28, that he says, "Don't marvel at this, for the hour is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice. They will come forth, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation." It wasn't a new concept either. Daniel 12, verse 2, the concepts are the same in the Old Testament. Daniel 12, verse 2, he's not quoting verbatim, but he's sharing the same principles, the same steps that God has in his plan of salvation. She says back to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who came into the world." Jesus is going to use a physical type of life and death to teach a spiritual lesson of immortality and eternal death. He's going to use a physical example here. Now we can see that Martha has the confidence that Lazarus is going to be in the resurrection at Christ's return. She states that back to him. But still, Martha is hinting very gently that Jesus also had the authority to raise him back to the physical flesh right then and there. That's faith. And that's confidence to make that appeal, to ask that of Jesus Christ. Let's jump forward now again to John 12, verse 1. John 12, verse 1. So we know what happens when Lazarus comes out of the grave, and there's great rejoicing, and he's restored again, and he's with his family. Well, here we see the same touching scene from John's recollection of what happened when they're sitting down to that banquet meal at Simon the leper's house. Verses 1 through 3. Then 6 days before Passover, Jesus comes to Bethany, where Lazarus was, who had been dead. Now remember, he's now sitting at a meal. The raising of Lazarus has already taken place. They're in Simon's house now, and they're having this nice meal together. And verse 2, it says, there they made him a supper. Martha served. Lazarus was one who was sitting at the table with Jesus. Mary took a pound of costly oil of spikenard, anointed the feet of Jesus, wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of this oil. We can see that in a different gospel account that there was a reclining position to eat a meal. It was very common, customary to be low to the ground with cushions and to have a meal perhaps in a low table, maybe a circular table, where people would just be in a reclining position to eat. So Mary would have knelt at his feet on the outside of this center of the table and spreading the oil over his head and using her long flowing hair. Perhaps tears of gratitude were also dripping on Jesus' feet, perhaps. And so while all this is going on, again, the disciples are watching all this. They're watching intently. A powerful fragrance is filling the room of this spikenard. And instead of waiting to hear what Jesus Christ would say about the matter, Judas begins to murmur to those near him, complaining about how Jesus had allowed this woman to waste that very expensive spikenard, that fragrance that was so valuable. We remember Mary wished to do something to show her gratitude for what Jesus Christ did, raising her brother Lazarus from death. So she breaks the seal of this very expensive jar of perfume and pours it on Jesus, wiping his head and his feet with it, with her long hair, it says in John 11, verse 2. John 12, verse 4, but one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, we read this, who would betray him, said, why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? This he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief, and he had the money box or the purse or money bag, and he used it to take what was put into it. Can you imagine? Jesus Christ knew this for a long time. Some scholars feel it was about a year earlier when he says to the disciples, did I not choose you, the 12, and yet one of you is a devil? That was in John 6, verse 70. That probably, according to some scholars, took place about a year earlier. Jesus Christ knew his heart, and yet he longed with such great long-suffering and patience for Judas to have a change of heart. So perhaps he was thinking to himself, wow, if I can get that much cash in this money purse or money bag that I carry around for the whole group, and they used it for helping the poor and also for their own needs for preaching the gospel, Maybe I can dip into it even more, and nobody will ever notice. If they could sell that spikenard for a handsome amount of money. Here we are, even to the last Passover, Jesus quietly washing the feet of all these men. He gave again Judas every opportunity to have a change of heart. But did Judas ever surrender his pride, nor did he give up his worldly ambition and his thievery to add to all that? And here he is criticizing the lavish gesture made by Mary toward Jesus, and yet he would go on to betray Jesus Christ for 30 pieces of silver, far less value than that alabaster jar of spikenard, far less value. We know that Judas had very high hopes for Jesus Christ to be crowned as a temporal king in Israel. His eyes were blinded by his own ambition for advancement in this coming kingdom. Once it became clear, though, at that last Passover, that this was not going to happen in his lifetime, Judas's disappointment became very bitter. His anger motivated him to go to the priests and to sell out his Lord and Master for 30 pieces of silver. Can we see the contrast between two hearts? Between Mary on the one hand and her selfless act in preparing Jesus Christ's body for burial, and Judas Iscariot on the other hand, self-serving, filled with ambition, and his cunning ideas of advancement. Jesus Christ was the recipient of a wonderful gift from Mary while he was still alive. Jesus knew his hour of great trial was coming. It was ever before him. And now he was going to carry with him to his crucifixion this deed that Mary had just performed for him. The Bible exposition commentary says this: in a sense, Mary was showing her devotion to Jesus before it was too late. She was, quote unquote, giving the roses while he was still alive and not bringing them to the funeral. Her act of love and worship was public, spontaneous, sacrificial, generous, personal, and unembarrassed. Jesus called it a good work in Matthew and Mark, and both commended her and defended her. Both Matthew and Mark's gospel accounts commend and defend Mary, this beautiful act. Her beautiful act of worship brought a fragrance to the very house in which they were dining, and the blessing of her deed was spread throughout the world. Matthew and Mark also. This is still a quote from the Bible exposition commentary. Little did Mary realize that night that her love for Christ would be a blessing to believers around the world for centuries to come. When Mary came to the feet of Jesus, Mary took the place of a slave or a servant. When she undid her hair, which is something that Jewish women didn't do in public in those days, she humbled herself and, so to speak, laid her glory. A woman's glory is her long hair, it says in Proverbs. One of her glories is her long hair, and laid that glory at his feet. And so, again, that's the end of the quote from the commentary. The interesting thought it points out, though, is bringing the roses to a funeral. When people give accolades and very kind words in a funeral setting, and it does comfort the survivors when somebody has died and they're laying in state, but their lifeless bodies can't hear the words lavished on them many times by those people that go to funerals and to talk about the person who has died. It's interesting. There are cases when such words would be well spoken to weary, suffering people who need to hear them while they still can hear, and while such comfort and encouragement can do them good. How precious a fragrance are such words. That's the point made in the commentary. So, had Mary's humble act of devotion toward Jesus Christ in preparation for his burial was just the lesson his disciples needed to see. They needed to see the expression of her love toward him And Jesus Christ longed to see that same kind of attitude from his disciples. Jesus had been everything to the disciples leading up to that time. They did not realize just in a matter of days, though, that they were going to be deprived of his presence. They could no longer offer him tokens of gratitude for his generous love toward them while he was in the flesh. And so they would go about for a few days feeling like lost sheep. They would be afraid of the religious rulers, and they would be huddling in fear, and they would be confused over what just happened. But Jesus Christ did try to tell them over and over again. We continue John 12, verse 7. John 12, verse 7, because as Judas humiliated Mary with his remark about this waste of perfume as he looked at it, Judas was going to receive a rebuke from Jesus Christ, which was rare. It was very rare for their teacher, who was ever patient, guiding them in a constructive way, to criticize them. He always treated his disciples with patience and dignity. He never publicly embarrassed them or exposed their sins. But this important lesson was about to be one of those exceptions. We read this again, John 12, verses 7 and 8. Let her alone. She has kept this for the day of my burial. For the poor you will always have with you, but me you will not always have. And so she did this while he was still alive. And once again, this would carry him through to the crucifixion, and this would also be mentioned, and her deed would be praised for centuries to come. Mary, do you think she had a full understanding of the significance of her deed of love? Again, it looks like she knew that he was going to be buried soon. She was preparing his body for burial. But Jesus Christ explains to all the guests now in that house, Simon's house, the meaning of Mary's humble act. And it would have given her tremendous encouragement to hear these things. We're drawing to a close, but Mark 14, verse 9, again, what we read earlier, Mark 14, verse 9, assuredly I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will be told as a memorial to her. What is true greatness in God's eyes? Well, Jesus Christ demonstrated to humanity the way to true greatness. By his example, he teaches us what it means to minister to others. In his life and lessons, Christ has given a perfect example of the unselfish ministry, which declares the love of the Father towards us, his children. And then it says in Matthew 20, verse 26, a reference passage, Matthew 20, verse 26, whoever will be great among you, let him be your servant. You see, God the Father and the Son don't live for themselves. We know that from the very creation of the physical realm. By creating the world and upholding all things by their power, their infinite power, they're also constantly ministering to humanity. And in a more focused way, making constant intercession for you and me. Jesus Christ, day and night, is making intercession for his saints. It says in Matthew 5, verse 45, that God makes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. This is God's care for humanity, for which by the most part doesn't even comprehend it, doesn't even know that God upholds all things by his power and is intimately focused on this human creation of his. Let's turn finally to one more scripture in Hebrews 10, verse 19. Hebrews 10, verse 19. Here we can see the physical to spiritual analogies, the type reaching antitype, which is the same thing as saying the shadow reaching its substance or reality, a shadow reaching reality. It says Hebrews 10, verses 19 through 22, therefore, brethren, having boldness to enter the holiest by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way which he consecrated for us through the veil, that is, through his flesh, and having a high priest over the house of God. Let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. You see the allusion here. The passage alludes to the ceremony of water baptism, commanding all of us who would be called to undergo that water baptism. But there are also shades of the purification of the heart through the humbling lesson of the foot washing ceremony, which Jesus Christ instituted. Verses 23 through 25, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful, and let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting, encouraging one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching, meaning the day of Christ's return. So we looked at what I titled A Tale of Two Hearts. One heart expressed in Judas's betrayal just after his feet apparently were washed by the very Son of God, and then another heart expressing the deep gratitude that Mary had for what Jesus had done in raising her brother Lazarus. In his life and lessons, Jesus Christ has given us a perfect example what it means to serve unselfishly, which has its origins in God the Father. Again, God and his Son don't live for themselves. By creating the world and upholding all things, they're constantly ministering to humanity. And Jesus Christ came into the world to reveal the Father, to amplify his laws, to magnify God. So only true greatness in God's eyes is the greatness of humility. If pride and striving for supremacy are cherished, then the heart cannot enter into that closer fellowship with Christ that we expect and look forward to for baptized members going into Passover. Until many of us who are baptized members meet on that evening of Passover, we have this command, as we read earlier. I'll close with this, John 13, verse 14. John 13, verses 14 through 17. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you should do as I have done to you. Most assuredly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them.